Hello, everyone. So, I wanted to talk about The Exorcist Believer to help y'all out with the essay if you want to write about it. So, The Exorcist Believer, this is the sequel, one of the sequels to a movie known as the scariest movie of all time, and that is the famous classic horror movie from 1973, The Exorcist. So, if you don't know, just to give some context, The Exorcist, the first one, is about this girl named Reagan who becomes possessed by a demon, and her mother seeks the help of two Catholic priests who both end up dying to save her daughter. And that's basically what happens in that first one. And here we have a rather similar plot, only we have two girls this time. And we don't have two Catholic priests, we have a whole group of diverse people. And we'll talk about how that plays into what the message of this movie is. So, just to give some background info, this was the sixth Exorcist film after a long line of sequels produced throughout the decades that were not terribly well received. And this movie isn't too different, it mostly got negative reviews. But I do believe that there is a lot going on under the surface here. So, how about let's explore that and determine what the movie's message is? So, in order to understand the movie, we need to understand its context. So, the movie was released 50 years after the original movie. So, that is quite a long time. And that checks out, right? Because nowadays we see reboots all over the place, especially of classic movies. Also, I wanted to note how it was released, last year, 2023, our current moment. I noticed that our current moment right now is not that different from what was going on in 73. And I have these two pictures sort of to illustrate that. So 1973 was full of social change and social conflict. You have things like the civil rights movement in the 60s, they're coming off of that. You have things like the women's liberation movement, which was a movement against patriarchy and sexism. And you also had the sexual revolution, which was basically a movement that asserted that being married, traditional man and wife, white picket fence, 2.5 children, that's not the only valid form of sexual expression. So yeah, all that was going on back then, which is quite a lot of social change when you think about it. And also, we are experiencing a lot of social change, social conflict right now, I would say. We have things like the Black Lives Matter movement, which reached its crescendo, I would say, in 2020, with the death of George Floyd. We have ongoing debates about LGBTQ rights, especially transgender rights. So, we are also in a very socially changing time, just like the 70s. And I also wanted to talk about war. Of course, if you may have noticed, there are two major wars going on, one in Ukraine and one in Palestine. And similarly, they had Vietnam War in the 70s, and that was the first war, that people were able to see on their televisions, because used to, you had no idea what was going on overseas in a war. So they were seeing all these horrible, horrific images, not unlike the horrific images in a movie like The Exorcist from Vietnam. And nowadays we see updates from Palestine, from Ukraine on our phones with social media. And we're bombarded with horrific, horrible, violent images all the time nowadays. So yeah, I just thought that was significant that the two eras, the 70s and the 2020s, are kind of similar. And that'll come into play later. I also wanted to talk about how in the 70s, mental health, to give some socio-cultural context, mental health was kind of a taboo subject. People really didn't talk about it as much as they do now. And in the first Exorcist, we can see how the doctors, the psychiatrists, are portrayed as useless overall.
Well, it's a symptom of a type of disturbance in the chemical electrical activity of the brain. In the case of your daughter, in the temporal lobe. It's up here in the lateral part of the brain. It's rare, but it does cause bizarre hallucinations. And usually just before a convulsion.
A convulsion?
The shaking of the bed. That's doubtless due to muscular spasms.
Oh, no, that was no spasm. Look, I got on the bed. The whole bed was thumping and rising off the floor and shaking, the whole thing, with me on it.
Mrs. McNeil, the problem with your daughter is not her bed. It's her brain.
And that may or may not reflect the attitude towards mental health back then. It's sort of, in The Exorcist, mental health is basically dismissed. Well, I shouldn't say that. I should say mental illness is dismissed as not the cause of Reagan's problem. And it's not really discussed in the movie. Whereas in this new one, in Believer, we can see how Angela's possession sort of goes hand in hand with the fact that she lost her mother and she needs closure. And so, yeah, we can see the change from the 70s to 2023, where there's much more of a mental health is important aspect to this movie, which we will talk about some more. So there are several symbols in this movie. Like I was just talking about with mental health, the scarf is a very important symbol because it is what brings Angela closure at the end of the movie, right? It is a symbol of her mother's love, and Angela gets possessed, we can't forget, because she tries to contact her mother to get that closure, right? So what takes the demon away from her at the end of the movie is love, not ritual. And this also connects to the original movie, where the exorcism fails and Reagan is saved because Father Karras sacrifices himself for her in an act of love. We see this.
Take me! Come into me! God damn you! Take me! Take me!
We see the same thing here. The scarf represents love being more important than religion. Well, than religious ritual, I should say. So yeah, there is that. And we see how it connects to the old movie while putting a modern twist on it. I also thought it looked kind of similar to a stole that a Catholic priest would wear. You know, the scarf-like priestly garment. I think that just speaks to how religious ritual is not always effective, and that love is usually the route to go to save someone. Same with another one of her mother's artifacts, the seashells. They really reminded me of rosary beads, so I think items like that represent how love is superior to religious ritual. I also wanted to talk about the paper fortune teller. So the paper fortune teller basically is an object that represents choice. And of course, Victor has to make a choice at the beginning of the film, and the demon tries to trick the exorcism group into making a choice at the end of the film between the two girls. So that is what the fortune teller means, I would say. And it represents, just how difficult choices like that are. and the effect they can have on someone's mental well-being. So that would be the paper fortune teller. Also, we see Angela using it before she goes to conduct her little seance with Catherine, and that proves to be her downfall. So the paper fortune teller, I would say, represents fate as well. Then we have fungus on the tree. So on the tree, there's this fungus. We see it when the girls first go into the woods. And I would say that fungus represents death and decay, as fungus often does as a symbol. So death and decay is what we got here. And we see that with the girls. They very much start falling apart, losing their nails, and their feet all look decayed, etc., and their bodies slowly start there, especially in their faces, you can see the decay happening. So that's what I would say the fungus represents. So shoes and feet are a very important symbol. If you notice, there's a lot with feet, especially in the scenes with the blessing at the beginning, the seance, and then the exorcism at the end. So Angela's mother, she has her feet spat upon, and that was part of the protective blessing, I suppose. We also see that girls take off their shoes when they conduct the seance. And in the film, they talk about how they go to hell. I don't know how literal that is, but they go to hell, apparently, and burn their feet. And then, in the exorcism scene, they seem to want to combat that whole idea of take off your shoes and go to hell by making the exorcism room a holy place, because in the Bible, when Moses talks to God in the burning bush, God tells him to take his sandals off. So, the reason he does that is because he is stepping on holy ground. So, it looks like they want to sanctify the space where the exorcism will happen, and that's why they're not wearing their shoes. That's what I took from it, anyway. And yeah. We see how Tony, Catherine's dad, refuses to take his shoes off, which is really, ironic, because he was so obsessed with showing off his Christianity, and he liked bragging about his daughter and how she was a youth leader at the church. So maybe, excuse my French, but he seems to be full of shit, in other words, a hypocrite, a selfish, a Pharisee, to use a New Testament reference. He is quite selfish and not as much of a believer in Christianity as he seems to let on. Why doesn't he want to take off his shoes? It's very weird. So, yeah, his selfishness is ultimately why he loses his daughter, and they lose Catherine at the end. As opposed to self-sacrifice, which is how you save someone from possession, these movies seem to say. So selfishness bad, self-sacrifice good. Something else to talk about with this movie is how it parallels the original movie. So on one level, that might simply be it's a reboot and we have to include things from the original, but change them a little bit, as it goes with Hollywood. But on another level, I think that these parallels have some sort of rhetorical purpose and help the movie send its message. So I wanted to talk about them. For one thing, the film has a prologue in an exotic location. In this case, it's Haiti. In the original, it's Iraq. So, in the original, in Iraq, one of the priests who exorcises the demon out of Reagan or tries to, is Father Merrin, and we see him encounter the statue of the demon who possesses Reagan, Pazuzu, in the desert in Iraq. In this film, we see Victor and his wife in Haiti while she's pregnant, and we have the blessing scene for Angela, and then we have the earthquake scene. So, very different purposes to the prologue. One in the first movie seems to just exist to introduce one of the exorcists and the demon. In this case, we're not introduced to the demon really at any point at all in the movie, which is interesting and something we'll discuss here in a second. More so in Believer, the emphasis is on what happened to Angela's mother, and I think that's important because the whole film basically is about how Angela needs closure, and that will resolve her possession. Speaking of her possession, she is possessed because she wants to talk to her mother. It's like in the first movie, Reagan plays with a Ouija board. She isn't trying to contact anyone in particular, but the demon uses it as a way to enter her. So we can see how those first two things, the exotic location prologue and talking to the dead, they're sort of, the new film twists them, puts a modern twist on them, to where both relate to Angela needing to have closure, right? So this new film is much more involved with mental health than the last film was. The first film, mental health is never really discussed. It's just sort of thrown out there as a possibility for what's wrong with Reagan, but not an adequate explanation. So the third bullet point talks about the uncomfortable medical scenes. So we have those in both movies, much more intense in the first movie. And again, that just sort of goes along with trying to figure out what is wrong with girls in both movies. And they're uncomfortable, sort of, I would argue, to show that suffering is very real, and it's hard to find a way out of it. When you are sick, for example, and trying to understand what is wrong so you can fix it, there is a lot of anxiety there, right? And when you're being tested upon, like you're some sort of experiment or something like that, it's very real. I think sort of the blending between medicine and science and religion in both the movies, because remember in the exorcism scene at the end of Believer, we have those heart monitors. That just goes to show that mental illness, that sickness, physical and mental, are as horrible as something supernatural. So I think that's the reason why we have these really uncomfortable medical examination scenes in both movies. Speaking of uncomfortable things, we have a stabbing with a cross. In the first movie, I don't want to show you the clip because it's very graphic, but you can look it up for yourself if you want to. Reagan stabs herself with a crucifix while possessed, and she stabs the worst area you could stab with a crucifix. I won't say anything more than that, but it's really shocking, it's really visceral, and it goes to show how she's lost her innocence completely, for one thing. It also is an act of violence on the demon's part, an act of very horrible violence, and that pretty much is it. Honestly, it's a very famous scene, but it's mostly for the shock factor and to motivate her mother to do something about the situation beyond just going to the doctors for help. But in Believer, we see the mother from the first movie, Chris McNeil. She has her eyes stabbed out. So I thought a lot about that, and I think that goes with needing closure, The demon simply didn't want her to the demon didn't want her to see her daughter ever again, is the simplest way to read that. But, Chris, she says hope is what keeps me alive. So, and she does end up reunited with Reagan nonetheless. And it doesn't really matter that she lost her eyes. So the demon, I think, was trying to use something sacred to take away all of Chris's hope, all of her belief, and it didn't work. So that really adds to the whole theme of the necessity of closure in order to heal. And head spinning also occurs in both movies. In the original, demon rotates Reagan's head and it doesn't kill her because it's supernatural, I guess, an illusion maybe. Whereas in this movie, the Catholic priest's head is twisted until he dies. And I think it's, in the first movie, it's, again, shock, for one thing. It also reflects the fact that Reagan, while possessed, murders a man and turns his head around. And in this case, we have the demon murdering the priest by spinning his head. And I think the head spin in this case is also supposed to sort of usher him out of the plot, because he was supposed to be, the secret weapon who comes in at the last minute, but he does not come in, or he does not succeed in exorcising the demon. So that just sets up that love is what is needed. Closure for Angela is what is really needed. And then we have vomit. This actually has to do with a specific Bible verse. In the first movie, Reagan vomits this green liquid. In this movie, we have Catherine vomiting up this weird bloody mass. And I think it has to do with this. They read from Ezekiel during the exorcism, and the line immediately after the line they read, because they read this line: I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all your impurities and from all your idols. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And my interpretation is that Catherine vomits out the heart of stone, because after that she becomes her own self again. And I think this also ties into the whole theme of togetherness and cooperation, because we have three very different people. We have Victor, the skeptic. We have Baptist minister, Revens. We have Dr. Beehive, the practitioner of hoodoo root work. Extremely different people all working together, and it seems to work to get that heart of stone out of Catherine and return her to normal. But of course, they still lose her at the end. And finally, we have levitation. That happens in the first movie. Reagan levitates in her bed. In this movie, Angela is the one who levitates, and she, weirdly, I thought that was a bit much in my opinion, she vomits the demon out. It sort of goes into a vortex or something. I think, and that happens when she has the scarf on. So she is receiving closure in that instance, and that's sort of visually represented by the demon coming out. So, yeah, all these things from the first movie really have to do with the whole theme of you need closure in order to end your suffering. If you have lost someone you love, you need people to help you in your community, and those people need to know how to work together despite their differences. So all these elements from the old movie cleverly play into the message of the new one, I would argue. We already talked about self-sacrifice versus selfishness, so I won't dwell on it. But this slide basically tells us that self-sacrifice is important in this movie like it is in the first movie. In a way, Angela's mother does sacrifice herself for Angela. She tells Victor, protect her, almost like she's willing to die for Angela's sake. Of course, it's not clear if she knows that only one of them can be saved, her or Angela, but still, her loving sacrifice is portrayed as the right thing to do, and in the first movie, Father Karras sacrifices himself for Reagan, and in this movie we see how Tony trying to claim Catherine and sacrifice Angela is the wrong thing to do. Self-sacrifice and love are important. Selfishness is bad. There's several biblical references. We went over Ezekiel and Moses, so I won't dwell on them. We didn't talk about the white horse, the one that is dead outside the barn, where the girls are found. In Revelation, Jesus rides a white horse, and he draws a flaming sword from his mouth, and he defeats Satan, who is described as an ancient serpent. And I think that's where the snake comes in, because they find a snake in that watery pit they go into, the girls go into. Victor runs into a snake there. So it's a very demonic place, and it's literally hell, I guess, because at the end, Catherine gets drowned, dragged into hell by the demon at the end of the movie. So, yep, snake equals devil, Satan, I would say, present in that place where they did the seance. The white horse, Jesus rides a white horse. The horse is white, it's pure, its death could represent the girls losing their innocence when they're in the demon's clutches. And it's a quite sad image, because it seems hopeless. Who's going to save them? Because of course Jesus is the one who defeats Satan, and they do invoke him in the exorcism scene, but they still end up losing one of the girls, unfortunately. Herd of pigs. In the New Testament, Jesus cast demons out of a person and into a herd of pigs. And we see Angela sympathizing with pigs at the beginning, not wanting Victor to eat bacon, which I thought was kind of interesting, as if it's foreshadowing that she's going to be possessed, in other words. Let's also talk about that bathtub. That was a dirty, dirty bathtub. And I think it's supposed to be a perversion of Jesus turning water into wine. And that is interesting, because the girls are compared to Jesus, right? Because they are said to go to hell as Jesus did, and reappeared after 3 days. So they are sort of antichrist, for lack of a better word. The demon sort of turns them into antichrist. And yeah. So yes, we talked about Ezekiel and Moses, and there's also Psalms. So Psalm 1 is what Catherine has open when Chris goes to confront her / the demon, holding it upside down. Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and who meditates on his law day and night. That person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever they do prospers. So, I honestly, it might just be a coincidence that they decided to have her looking at the book of Psalms. But we do have a tree mentioned here, comparing the righteous person to a healthy tree. And honestly, that does stand in deep contrast with the tree with fungus on it, doesn't it? The tree of decay. And of course, she's holding the book upside down. Because the demon's trying to subvert that, trying to make Catherine wicked. So, I thought that was quite interesting. Now, this other reference is very strange. After Chris seemingly succeeds in delivering Catherine from the demon, she says this: "I am no devil, for there is none." That's from the Book of Mormon. I tried to find it elsewhere, but it is apparently just in the Book of Mormon. I will confess I'm not very familiar with the Book of Mormon, but there we go. What I would say with this is we have, the interdenominational exorcism at the end. So it takes all kinds to save the girls. They even say that in the film. It takes all kinds. So of course we're gonna have some diverse scripture quoted. So that just happens to be there, and I think it goes along with the diversity theme. And also the theme of belief. I am no devil, for there is none. It is often said that the greatest trick the devil ever played was convincing the world he doesn't exist. So, or at least that's a phrase I've heard tossed around sometimes. So, yeah. In order to confront the demon, Victor has to step outside his normal belief system. And maybe even take a leaf from the Book of Mormon. Yep. So, and believe that the devil is real in order to help his daughter. Alright. Because if you don't respect other people's beliefs, the film seems to say you can't get along with them. And if you can't get along with them, then they can't help you save. They can't help you when you need help. Finally, in general, we have a lot of heaven and hell imagery in this. We have the snake in the watery pit in the forest where they do the seance. That sort of makes it a hellish space. And then it sort of becomes hell for real at the end. We also have the fireplace, which I would argue is rather hellish. And we have the light above the girls. Now, I took this to mean that the girls are stuck between heaven and hell. And, of course, the light eventually flickers and goes out once Tony says, "I choose you, Catherine." So his selfishness is what denies her heaven. So that is what I took from that. There's also other references that I think help with what the film is going for, such as the Raven, which is red, which the students are listening to on a TV in class in an early scene. The Raven is about the death of a beautiful woman. Lenore, if you have ever read that poem by Edgar Allan Poe, and how a man who is mourning her death is haunted by a raven who is said to be demon-like, to have all the seeming of a demon that is dreaming. So that obviously fits in with the movie, because Angela's mom dies, Victor becomes haunted by a demon. The other literary reference is the Jabberwock from Lewis Carroll. Now, I would say the Jabberwock looks a lot like the demon in the movie. And if you're like, where did this demon person show up? Well, she's actually only seen in a few flashes in the movie at the end. But she rather resembles a famous illustration of the Jabberwock, I would say. With her wings and her horns. We have more feelers here, but she generally looks like the Jabberwock, and she seems to reside in the forest as the Jabberwock resides in the Tulgey Wood. And I think it's significant that this is taken from Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland, which is all about nonsense, right? And it could be said that demons are nothing but nonsense. They don't exist. But you have to get outside your belief system sometimes if you want to help your loved ones. And, they very well could exist. So that's why I think they chose to reference Lewis Carroll and Alice in Wonderland specifically. So yes, the demon, if you didn't know, is Lamashtu from Mesopotamian mythology. She is known for killing babies, terrorizing pregnant women, causing miscarriages, so of course she fits well into the narrative of this movie, where Angela nearly dies in the womb, and of course she also claims Catherine. So that's Lamashtu. She's a real mythological figure. Interestingly enough, this ties back to the original movie where the demon was Pazuzu. So Pazuzu is also an evil demon, but he was summoned by ancient Mesopotamians to ward off Lamashtu because they were rivals. So that's interesting. So this demon is connected to the demon in the first movie. And I also think it says something that we have non-Christian demons in this. I think it says that perhaps there's truth to all religions, perhaps, or that evil is ancient, older than Christianity. At the end, Anne, in the closing monologue, mentions Job, which is the oldest book in the Bible, and it's all about suffering. So perhaps, and suffering is a major theme in the movie, so perhaps they went with this older than the Bible, older than Christianity demon in order to show that suffering is ancient. It's as old as time, and these demons are as old as history, it seems. Yeah, and also it ties into the diversity theme because it's a demon from a non-Christian religion. So there we go. So what is the message of all this, you might be asking? How can I put it concisely? Well, I'll tell you. I think the message of this is that diversity and togetherness are our strength. Which rather fits into our current moment where diversity is a hot topic, and sometimes media is accused of being too woke, whatever that means. I'm not sure if I would call this movie woke. I would say it definitely does say we all should be able to get together. We have to also go outside our belief systems and put aside our differences if we want to work together to end suffering, because the movie says that suffering is what evil is. Evil is suffering, and we need to work together and get over our differences if we want to defeat it. And the way to defeat it is through love and self-sacrifice, not religious ritual. And I think that really resonates today, considering we have such large and small scale social conflict going on in a world that isn't all that different from '73 when the first movie came out. We have two major wars. We're a divided country. Most people seem to agree. So, I would take this message to heart. The Exorcist Believer seems to be just another one of those Hollywood reboots, but I think there's a lot going on with it. And those are my final thoughts on The Exorcist Believer. I hope this informed you as to what the movie's message is, and I hope it assists you in writing the essay wherein you have to state in your thesis what the message is, and in your body paragraphs argue how it sends that message, and hopefully this video gave you some ideas. Alright, thank you guys. I'll see y'all next time.